Hello again, everybody. I want to show in this video that functions can operate in a lot of different ways. In previous videos, you've seen just the basics of the syntax for functions, how you define them, where you define them, and how you can call them in order to get some value. So now let's look at some variations of things that we can do with functions. Now, one of the first things that we can do is look at functions that do not accept any kind of parameter at all. So in the function getAtContent, we passed in a variable called DNA. And let's look at what we're doing here. In this example, we just set a variable in the main program called myDNA to that string of bases, and then we call getAtContent. We sent in myDNA. Remember that myDNA is the actual parameter. That's the parameter that really has something. So when you call the function, then you send in this information, and in the function itself, there's what we call a dummy parameter that does not have a value until we call the function. So those line up. We're using myDNA as the actual parameter, and we call the function, and when we call the function, we send it in to the dummy parameter that's inside the function. Okay, at any rate, that was a bit of a review. So now let's modify this function and show you that it's okay, it's syntactically correct. First of all, let's run the program. We need to make sure the program works, right? So let's run this program and let's get the output and look at the answer. So I'll bring over the output, and here you can just see that we just got the number 0.53 for the AtContent. So this program works. So it's good to know we didn't have any errors when we're starting out. Now, let's modify the program, and let's put a comment here that says that that we do not have to have a parameter for a. So I've got a comment that I'm going to put here, which says there can be functions with no arguments. Well, let's just modify this little function that we have, the getAtContent, to illustrate this, and we can delete the DNA part. So now we just have the empty parentheses. So that means that this function cannot accept an input. And just to prove that, let's try to call the function as we did previously, and let's see what happens. So when I run the program this time, then you'll notice that we get a lot of red output. So this is indicating that the getAtContent, it says it takes 0 arguments, but yet we gave it 1. So we get an error if we try to run the program like that. But we can call the function, and we don't have to have a parameter. We can leave that empty. Now, when that happens, what is the value for the DNA over here? All right, well, let's give that a try. So let's run the program again, and let's look at the output. I'll bring over the output, and now we get another kind of error. So it says that we don't have anything. We don't have a parameter. The function itself, it's expecting a variable DNA, but we didn't give it one. And there's no DNA variable in our program anywhere. So this isn't going to work either. So if we wanted to do something like this, then we would have to be sure that we have a variable called DNA, and it has to match exactly the variable that's in here. So we could do that. Okay, suppose I didn't have the variable myDNA. Suppose I just called it DNA. Okay, now there's a variable in the main program called DNA, and there's a variable in the function called DNA. So this will actually work. All right, so let's run the program and prove that that works. And here's the output, and there are no red words. So now this does work. So we get the same answer, 0.53. Now that illustrates that you can have a function with no arguments, but this isn't a good situation. The reason is that now whenever we call the function, we have to have a variable in the main program that's the same as the variable in the function. So each time we call it, we'd have to set up a new DNA here. Instead of using maybe some other variable like myDNA or new DNA or whatever the variable might be. So it's much more convenient if we do have a parameter for the function, And we try to keep all the data that pertains to the function within the function itself. But the whole point here is to show that you do not have to have an argument for a function. Well, why would we want to have a function without an argument? In some cases, you can, okay, and you might want to use it for, and let me give an example here. Suppose you want to print a nice banner either out to a file or out to your screen. So I'm going to put a little function in here that I'm going to call banner. So I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to paste it in, and it isn't going to have any arguments either. So let's put it here. We can just stack our functions up. And here is the function. So it's called banner, and it doesn't have any arguments, so just have the empty parentheses, and then we have the colon. So it has a series of print statements. So this is just going to print a banner or some information to the screen. Now you can choose to put whatever you want in here. If you wanted to put your name, if you wanted to put your company or some important information that you wanted output to the screen every time, then that's great. So you just have this little function here, and that would work. All right, now let's call banner, and we'll do it here. So I'm just going to call banner, and it's easy. Okay, we just have banner and then empty parentheses. So that's how we can call the function. The function has no inputs. It's called banner. So when I do this, then it's going to call the function. The function is going to print out those lines, and then it's done. Then after that, we will print the value of our AT content from the get AT content function using the DNA variable here. All right, so now let's illustrate how this banner function works. I'll move the output window over so we can see it. And there's the output. So the banner function, it just printed a design at the top of your program. And like I just mentioned, you might want to put your name there. You might want to put in, if you're doing a homework problem, you might want to put your name in here and what the problem is, or some information like that. At any rate, that's an example of a good use of a function that doesn't have any input parameters. Let's continue to use our getAtContent function and illustrate another feature. You do not have to have a return in every function. And in fact, we didn't have a return here in the banner function. Okay, so that's something that's also optional. Okay, you do not have to have the return statement. So what would we do instead? If we didn't have the return statement, how do you get the data back to the main program? Well, you can't. But what you might want to do instead is just print the data from within the function itself. So that's something that we could do. So let's just modify this so that we can have the function print the output. When we run the program, then here's the output that we get. So we still have the banner prints the banner, and then inside our function now we print out the AT content is 0.53. But what happened in the main program? We still have this print statement, print str, string AT content, because we call the function with that line. But what happens if we don't have the return statement? Well, without the return statement, then nothing comes back. So if we don't get a return from a function and we try to print something out, then Python's going to print out none. But it's okay to do that. If you prefer, you can have your function print out whatever you'd like. But generally, it's better programming practice if you return a value and let your main program output the result. That's just better programming practice. It gives you more flexibility when you want to use the function. For example, if you want your function to compute the AT content and then send that back to the main program to print to a file, then you don't have to change the function to do that. In this case, we're kind of hard-coded, what we call it. It's hard-coded so that this is always going to print to the screen. So it's okay to do it, but it gives you less flexibility with your functions. So the bottom line, or the point here, is functions do not require a return statement. Before I go on to the next example, I have returned these functions to their original form. So the getAtContent, now I put the variable back in there because that's the way it should be. Better programming style to do that. And I've put the return statement here back into the function as well. And when I'm calling getAtContent, I'm returning that to my DNA, which is defined here. For the next thing that I want to point out about functions, I want to use the body mass index function that we had used earlier in a previous video. So here it is. So in this case, our BMI function is going to accept three parameters: the weight, the feet, and the inches, and then it does a calculation and it returns the body mass index rounded to 2 digits to the right of the decimal. Now, in the previous video, we actually used a input to get all those inputs from the screen, so I'm going to put that code back in here as well. So let's put that down here. Let's make some space for that, and I'll put that in right here. So this is the same as from a previous video. We have variables weight, feet, and inches. I used inches previously. I'm using INC this time because of something that I want to do. And let's not put that part in just yet. Okay. So the program will prompt to the screen these things you see here in green with double quotes. So you know how input works by now. So we will enter a value that has to be converted to a real number using float and assigned or stored into the variable weight. Same thing for feet, same thing for the inches. Okay, now we want to call our body mass index function and get it to calculate the value, and then we will have the function return that and we'll print it out in the main program. So let's add the code back to do that. So to complete that program, we'll just put the code here. So we will call the BMI function, we'll send it the three parameters. The function returns a value which we save in the variable body mass, and then we print that out. Now, so I've put back the body mass index function. It's important when you're calling the functions to be sure that you have the parameters in the correct order. So the function is expecting weight to be first, feet to be next, and inches to be third. So if we mix up the order that we're calling the function, then it would think that maybe the feet was the weight and the weight is the feet and so on. So the order of these is important. So whenever we call the function BMI, we have to put the weight first and then the feet and then the inches in order for that to work. Well, there is another way that you can call a function where the order of the variables, of the parameters, it doesn't matter. And this is called named variables. So we can leave the function as it is, the weight and the feet and the inches, but we can call the function with the changing up the order. But first, let's make sure the program works. So let's run the program and make sure that it is correct. It turns out there was an error, so let me go ahead and show you the error. So when I called the function, then it told me that inches is not defined. Okay, well that's because I changed the variable name, but I didn't change the call. So in the main program, when I call the body mass index function, I use inches, but I had changed the variable to INC over here. So that gave me an error. So it's good to see the errors that I commit as we go along. So let me fix that. It says INC. So now that should work okay. So now the program is running. So let's enter some data. Enter your weight. Let's say 170. And let's say 5 feet and 10 inches. And then we get a value back. Okay, so now the program really is working. So now we can go forward from here. And we can look at those named variables. So the function wants weight, it wants feet, and it wants inches. Well, I don't have to call it in that order if I used these named variables. So what I can do is I can use weight and I can set it to WT, and I can use feet and set it to feet in any order that I want to. Okay, so let's take these variables out. And I'm going to put in feet is equal to FT, comma, and I'm going to put in inches, and that's equal to INC. And then the last one, I'm going to put a comma here. And the last one, I'm going to put in the weight, and I got to spell that out. Okay, weight is equal to WT. Now, this is a different order for the arguments. So I'm listing the feet over here as the first one, even though the body mass index function wants weight over there. But since I have used the names of the variables, then it doesn't care what order they're in here. So it associates my main program ft variable with the function variable feet. And it associates my main program variable inch with the function variable inches. And finally, it associates the main function variable weight with weight of the function. So this is just another technique you can use. If maybe you don't remember what order, or you want to make sure that you call the function without making errors, then this is one way to do it, and it's called named variables. Okay, named variables. All right then. Well, let's run the program and use this technique and see if it really does work. So I'll bring over the output window. So there it is, and the program is going to look exactly the same. Okay, so let's enter our weight. So I'll make some numbers up, 160, and let's say 5'8", and we get the body mass index computed. All right, so that is another technique that functions allow you to use. You can use named variables where you associate the name in your main program with the name of the variable in your function. So that works just fine. Now, there's one final technique that I do want to show here. So I'm going to also use the body mass index function to do that, but I'm going to make a copy of it and name it something different to illustrate this next feature. Now, so far, this function is the same as the BMI function. I'm just giving it a different name, okay, because I want to have two different functions to illustrate these two different options that you can use with functions. But right now they are identical except for the name. Now, with functions, you can set what we call default values. And this may not be the best example to illustrate that, because typically we would call the BMI function, for different people with different heights and weights, so it would be kind of silly to do this. But to illustrate how this would work, let's suppose I want to set a default value. So I can have feet equals and 5. Right? So this gives a default value for feet. And let's illustrate inches is, say, equal to 6. So this then provides default values, and I can call the function, and I can call it with weight only, and it would fill in the values for feet and inches. So now let's illustrate how we can do that. So I'm going to paste the call here at the bottom of our main program. And notice this time, I'm just going to use a number like 160 pounds. And that's the only argument, just 160. So I'm not going to I won't be passing in the feet and the inches. So what will happen is it will use 5 for the feet and it will use 6 for the inches. So those are called default parameters. And when you have default parameters, then you don't have to use all three when you call the function. So let's run the program and make sure this works. So I'll bring over the output window, and I've already typed in the information for the previous call, that one right there. So I typed in 175.10, and I got the 24.39 from the BMI function. Then I'm calling the body mass index function, but I'm just sending in one number, the 160. So it works, okay? So 160 is the weight. It calculates a BMI value, 25.82, and it returns that. But the function itself used 5 for feet and it used 6 for inches. All right, so you can call a function using fewer than the number of arguments that are in the function, fewer than the number of dummy arguments, as long as you give them some default values, 5 feet, 6 inches. Now, even though you give them default values, you can still call that same function with other values as well. So let's say 160, and let's do 6 for the feet, comma, and let's use 2 for the inches. So if I call the function with 3 arguments, then the 6 is going to overwrite the default value 5. Okay, and the 2 for inches, that's going to overwrite the 6 that I have in here. All right, now I'll run the program one last time and we'll look at this output. So we'll bring over the output window. And once again, I've already typed in the information for the first call to the BMI function. And here's now the call for the body mass index function, where I've passed in 160, 6, and 2. So if you have a function, you can specify some default parameters if you want to. I could also put a default for weight if I wanted to. So then here are just some additional options that you can use with functions. So to go over them again briefly, you can have a function that does not have an input parameter at all, like we do with Banner. That's no input. You can have a function that does not have a return, which is also illustrated with Banner. And I also showed you earlier that you can take out the return and just put in a print statement, and you don't need to return. And you can also use a named variables whenever you're calling your function, so that if you don't want to use the same order that the variables appear in the function, you can use this approach, named variables. And then finally, you can set defaults for the parameters in your function. And when you do that, you don't have to include them in the function call. But if you do want to include them, then the values that you use here to call the function, those will override the defaults that are in the function itself. So there are many other variations we can do with the functions, but that gives you some to think about and perhaps use them in your coding as well. So that concludes this video. So we'll stop.